Hey y'all, how are you doing? I'm great. Thank you so much for asking. It's me, Kim, and I'm back for another video. This video is a conversation with Tre'vell Anderson. Tre'vell is an award-winning journalist. He co-hosts this amazing podcast called Fanti. Okay, let me tell y'all about Fanti. Fanti is Tre'vell and co-host Jarrett Hill expertly deconstructing Black pop culture topics in a really methodical way with citations and expertise. It's truly one of my favorite things on the internet. Listen to it. But I wanted to talk to them because they appear in this Netflix documentary called Disclosure. Now, Disclosure is about the history of trans representation, and it taught me so much. There are so many anti-trans and transphobic tropes all throughout our media that you won't even recognize unless you're really looking for them or unless they affect you directly. I highly suggest that everybody who is interested in justice for trans people, please watch it, because I feel like I might have inadvertently participated in some of these things. But anyway, we talked about television. We talked about movies. It was such a pleasure. Look, Tre'vell is a great talker. So fun and funny and interesting, but also so incredibly thoughtful and knowledgeable. This was really a delight. Here's our conversation. First of all, Tre'vell, thank you so much for taking some time to talk to me.
Thank you for having me.
Big fan. I truly am. The best part of this job is talking to people who I listen to or watch or follow on Twitter. I legit love your work.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I have to give a shout out to Bianca, who is one of your patrons who, made this connection. Shout out to Bianca.
Love it. Love a well-connected queen. Appreciate it so much. Okay. So because I have you here, and yesterday were the Emmy nomination announcements, I have to talk to you about that. Were you surprised by anything? Were you surprised by any snubs or nominations?
I can't say I was surprised by anything per se, because, the Emmys like to do the same old. I was happy to see that Insecure as a show got a comedy series nomination. So shout out to them. I think this past season was their best season. And that's not to say the previous ones weren't great as well, but they really delved into some really interesting things. And then, obviously, the girls on the internet are upset about Pose's lack of representation. Shout out to Billy Porter, who got another nomination, but the members of the trans cast still have not yet been recognized. And so that's a little bittersweet when it comes to the general recognition that Pose has been getting. But yeah, I guess those would be my highlights.
Okay, this is important, and it connects to what this conversation is going to be about. I saw Raquel Willis on Twitter talk about Pose, a show that is path-breaking in its representation of trans women, but the only nomination was for the cis gay man. It does seem like they are reproducing some inequality and marginalization while trying to have some cover for being diverse.
Yeah, well, that's how Hollywood is, unfortunately. I think it's an unfortunate thing to say, but there is a hierarchy in terms of which people from which communities can get the attention first, right? And the cis men are first, typically, cis straight men, typically white, and then all the way down at the bottom, unfortunately, are our Black trans and gender expansive folks. And it is, I think, kind of an unfortunate occurrence, but, it's where we are. And I think those are the instances where we realize that all this conversation about diversity, about inclusion, and about equity, particularly in this particular moment, but even, post Oscars So White, it really falls on deaf ears if the action doesn't follow through from some of these verbal commitments, right?
Yeah. And I think it's useful to note that it's mainstream, but it's also BET. I remember there being some uproar that at the BET Awards, the cast of Pose was not well represented. Trans women, trans people, non-binary people were not represented there either.
Well, we know BET has a history when it comes to queer and trans folks, who even like specifically Black queer and trans folks, both in terms of just like the representations of us as characters, right, on their shows, on their network, but also as celebrities, as actors, as talent. You know, for folks who don't know, you know, B. Scott, who is a famed gender nonconforming presenting queer individual of lovebscott.com. You know, he had his issue with BET, what, 5, maybe a little bit over 5 years ago at this point in time, and like ended up suing BET and won. To be clear, for their discrimination, right? And then we've seen in terms of just like what it means for the people who are on pose of these Black trans women who are getting some, you know, mainstream attention, not even being able to get attention from a BET or an NAACP Image Awards, you know, because there was a situation with them as well. I think what we try to have a conversation about in this moment is that it's kind of that whole conversation about like, if you believe Black lives matter, right, then all Black lives need to matter, right? Including the Black trans ones, the Black gender expansive ones, including the Black folks for whom you don't necessarily agree with. And what does it look like when these systems that we have created to honor our folks aren't honoring all of our folks? And I think that's what we are trying to, like, you know, push forward and push beyond.
Yeah. I appreciate Gen Z so much because I feel like they just have a better grasp on these things. I was wondering how you feel about Euphoria, and Euphoria is tricky because it's made by a man my age, like like a 35-year-old like white man, Sam Levinson.
Yes.
But it's supposed to represent the experiences of Gen Z younger people, and they have very prominently featured a white trans girl.
Oh my fucking God.
What?
That's him.
Who?
The guy.
What guy?
The one from the motel.
Okay, what guy are we looking at?
Okay, the one in the apron serving the chili. I swear to God.
No fucking way. Jules, do you know who that is?
Yeah, the guy from the motel.
It's Cal Jacobs.
Who's that?
Nate Jacobs' dad.
That's Nate's dad?
That's Nate's dad.
No fucking way!
No fucking way. You're full of shit.
No way!
You're full of shit.
The character's name is Jules, but it's played by Hannah Schaefer. How do you feel about that show? Hunter Schaefer,
yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I actually really enjoy what I've seen of Euphoria. I haven't seen it all, but I remember not all of it. You know, dealing with the kids, it was a lot for me. Those first couple episodes.
It is. You know what? Totally. Actually, when I first approached Euphoria, I was like, "This is weird. I'm grown, and we're gonna watch people supposed to be teenagers hooking up and." It's like, it was a lot.
It's a lot.
Then everybody's doing it, so I had to do it too.
Yeah, I mean, but I will say I had the opportunity to like screen the first episode in advance. And one of the things I really love about what they did is like the ways in which Jules's transness is introduced. If you're not paying attention, if you just don't know, then you don't find out her identity and her transness until a little later in the series. And I think when we talk about trans representation and trans characters, it's about moving past kind of that coming out phase, past that disclosure phase, and allowing trans folks on screen to just like live like everybody else, you know, to live and love and have problems. And, you know, Sam, the creator of Euphoria, also did another project called Assassination Nation a couple years ago. And it's a film that has another trans character played by a trans woman, Hari Neff. She's primarily known in the modeling world. But also similarly, it's a character that it's one of those instances where a white cis man like obviously did his work, like did the research to make sure that this character that he was putting together wasn't completely problematic, and that actually pushes the bounds of what trans representation looks like. Because, you know, we still have so many other examples of images of trans folks, gender expansive folks that, like, you know, in 2020 just don't cut it. Like, we want to see more. We want to see better.
Yeah. All right, let's get into the representation piece. I wanted to talk to you because I watched this documentary called Disclosure on Netflix, and it was just so interesting and well made and comprehensive. And I really wanted to have a thoughtful discussion about it. And there's some things in there that I think we can dig into. Okay.
Let's do it.
Okay. So for a long time, there has been this conversation, and I think it's like been primarily about how Black male comedians dress up as women.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like, I don't know, Dave Chappelle didn't originate it, but I really feel like he catalyzed it because he was so famous and so big when he was making these kinds of criticism.
Mm-hmm.
And I always felt like that conversation was rooted in misogyny and homophobia, but I really did not connect until watching this documentary, the connection to transphobia.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, how do you feel about now? Those criticisms are still ongoing, and especially in the age of social media, it seems like a lot of male comedians, cis male comedians, do get on by portraying Black women. Do you think that continues to contribute to transphobia, discrimination?
It does, because what it tells people who don't know trans folks, or who think they don't know trans folks, right? Because trans folks are all up and through your lives. You just don't know that we're there. And a lot of times that's because, we need to be stealth, or we need to reserve the responsibility of like disclosing for survival reasons, right? But we've always been here. But I do think it contributes to this conversation about transphobia, because what it does is it tells people who don't know a trans person that trans people are often like, men in costumes, right? That they are men in wigs, that we deserve to be laughed at and mocked. And that is the only way kind of that our life experience has some validity or some credence, is if you're laughing at it. And what that means then, right, is that the men, the women, and the beings who love us as trans people and as gender expansive people feel like they can't love us in public. They can't love us out loud, because the rest of the world thinks that we are men in wigs, right? They'll be considered gay, right? And no one wants to be considered gay in so many of our communities, right? And so then what happens? So then they kill us, right? And there is an epidemic, right now, in addition to the pandemic, right, that we're all dealing with in terms of Black trans women in specifically being killed. And the major perpetrators of this violence are their lovers, right? Who are, to be clear, Black men, okay? And so all of it is very much connected. There's homophobia, there is misogyny, and like just anti-femme, anti-woman ideals that are often carried out in a lot of these characters. And we speak about it so much with Black men, but it's also with white men as well, right? Robin Williams and Mrs. Doubtfire, rest in peace. Tootsie, Bosom Buddies, so many other even Alfred Hitchcock, if we want to take it back, a lot of his characters that engaged in this gender deviance or this gender play were evil. They were violent. They were deceptive, right? And so it just contributes to this improper idea about who we are as trans people, and it doesn't allow us to, exist and move through the world just like everyone else.
Yeah. Your pronouns are they.
Yes.
They, them. And you identify as non-binary.
Yes.
So how do you feel about these conversations that inevitably pop up, usually by more small c conservative Black folks, about the emasculation of the Black man? Like, this is a targeted assault on the image of Black men.
It's funny because I feel like folks love to just pit people against each other, right? They don't realize that the ways in which you feel that, like, for example, the Black family is under assault, or that the idea of Black men is under assault. All we've done is internalize the very same othering that has happened to us. Right. And so it's kind of like an oppression Olympics sort of thing that happens, where it's like, we as Black people, you know, generally feel as if we are at the lowest part of the totem pole. And I'm going to quote something from an episode of Pose. MJ Rodriguez's character, Blanca, she says something to the effect of like, you know, everybody needs somebody to step on.
It was over before it started. Everybody needs someone to make them feel superior. That line ends with us, though. This shit runs downhill past the women, the Blacks, Latins, gays, until it reaches the bottom and lands on our kind.
Right?
Yes.
And so for Black people, it's the Black, queer, and trans folks, right? Because for whatever reason, we buy into these systems of power and these systems of oppression instead of trying to create something completely new and something completely different that gives space for all of us to exist. And so when it comes to this idea of like, you know, the emasculation of the Black man, it's like, first of all, these people who you were talking about, specifically trans folks, the binary trans folks, right? The ones who you are calling men aren't men. Right? They're women, right? And so like we have to first start there and realize that like this argument of like the emasculation of Black men, when we talk in particular about Black trans women, is flawed on its foundation, right? Because Black trans women are women. Black trans women are not men. And we need to have conversations, right, about like just the general difference between gender and sex. Because people don't know that, right? And I don't say that as kind of an elitist way in terms of like knowledge or vocabulary, but like, you know, the education systems across this country are trash, right? The people's abilities to engage in conversations about sex, sexuality, identities, is trash. And it's because we've grown up in these worlds that have basically told us how we're supposed to show up. When many of us, right, I often say, I quote, Fatima Jamal, she's a model, filmmaker, etc. But I interviewed her a few years ago for the LA Times, and she talked about how we, as humans, as all beings, fail this concept of gender. Black cis men, Black women, Black queer and trans people, we all fail these conceptions of gender because they were made, right, with white folks in mind, right? They centered white folks. They centered white femininity and white masculinity. And therefore, for us as Black folks to buy into that conversation, it doesn't do us any favors, any of us any favors, right? And so when we talk about transphobia, when we talk about the ways in which the broader world wants to further marginalize us, right? We also have to note that like transphobia also impacts cis Black women as well and cis women as well, right? The ideas about how someone's womanhood, right, is rooted in their ability to have children, or it's rooted in the fact that they have breasts, right? That forces women, cis women, to kind of, it just essentializes their being into just their body, right? And it does them no service as well, in addition to, right, not doing service to welcoming and creating an idea and a concept of womanhood that is inclusive of also cis women who can't have children, right? You know, cis women who don't have breasts because they had to get them removed for whatever health reasons, right? It's just about thinking, I think, when we have these conversations about the ways in which it impacts us as individuals, whether you're cis or trans or non-binary or whatever the case may be, all of these systems don't do any of us any favors. And so we need to really, you know, burn them all down.
Yeah. I've been having these conversations over the past couple of weeks, and I'm like, y'all don't see, like this would open up if we evolve a little bit. This would open up so much space for all Black women.
Listen, okay.
Yeah. So I am very wary of the phrase representation matters. I feel like people invoke it in a way that is often super, super vapid. But I will say that while I was watching Disclosure, it really reminded me about how representation shapes people's views of communities that they don't necessarily have access to in real life, but also how representation can help shape your view of yourself. I guess I don't know. I forgot that, but I didn't realize how many transphobic tropes that I've interacted with all throughout my life until I really sat down and watched this documentary. I'm really interested in you as a non-binary person. There's still not a lot of representation of non-binary people, and certainly not Black non-binary people. And so what effect has that had on you?
So I always say that like my identity formation took multiple steps. It took multiple levels based on what I saw in media. I am from Charleston, South Carolina. I am the child of a single parent. I am my mother was in the military, in the Army for 23 years. My grandmother was a pastor. Those are the things that like made up my surroundings. And so, to be quite frank, there weren't any, openly queer or openly trans people in the world that I grew up in. And for me, in terms of my identity, it started first, with Black gay characters, right? The more effeminate Black gay characters. So I always give a shout out to Daryl Stevens, who played Noah in Noah's Ark in the early 2000s. I always give a shout out to Miss J. Alexander and Andre Leon Talley, who were judges on America's Next Top Model. Those were the people who represented a glimmer of who I am and who I've ultimately become. But you're right, when it comes to Black non-binary characters on television, ain't nobody out there. Actually, I take that back. There's a new character on Starz' P-Valley by the name of Uncle Clifford.
All right, bitches. Booty battle rules. DJ Nascare gonna give each bitch 2 minutes to turn up. After that, you exit stage left. Winner wins 50 ducats and a hot plate. Any questions?
She uses she, her pronouns. That is a non-binary person in the South. I love that. Played by Nico Anand. I love that portrayal. I think it's doing really great things in terms of pushing the bounds of gender, particularly on television. But so it's tough, right? And part of that is also because I make it a point to say that like trans people have always existed, gender queer, gender non-binary people have always existed. You just have to look for us, even on television, even in film. And one of the things that I love about Disclosure is they reference this clip from D.W. Griffith's film, Bethula. Yes. Yes, that.
And there's a kind of like trans or, gender non-binary character who is kind of circulating around the cut in the narrative.
And there's a non-binary-ish character, right? In the film, who is around this pivotal moment in film history of using a jump cut to advance a storyline. And I think that's just like one example of the ways in which the conceptions and the ideas of gender nonconformity and gender expansiveness have always been present. We just don't talk about it. It's just like we look at it as comedic value, right? And as a comedic effect. And so, it's tough then to create oneself, right, based on the things that you see, right? I often say it's the similar type of thing for us as broader Black folks, right? How you have to look to your Ryan Goslings and your Leonardo DiCaprios and your Rachel McAdams, right, for ideas about what love looks like. Because we don't have, or for a long time, we didn't have a lot of examples of what young Black love looks like on screen. Shout out to Love Jones. And so it's that same thing where you're just pulling pieces. I'll take something from here. I'll take something from here. I'll take something from here. I'll put it in a big old pot of gumbo, and then you'll get this fabulous being. But in who I am today, I've been actually doing my own research and unearthing the stories of trans and gender expansive people that have come before me. That's one of the reasons why I love Disclosure so much, because while they pack a lot of history in there, it also, tells me that I tweeted when Disclosure came out that like one of my favorite movies of all time is The Cheetah Girls. Okay, don't judge. Okay. Don't judge. But it's the Cheetah Girls, and I thought that my connection to Cheetah Girls, right, was because of Raven Simone, right, who down the line, right, came out as queer. But when in reality, right, there was a Black trans woman also in that movie.
When I see you girls, I see myself.
Who, wasn't able to live out loud as a trans woman until she got in her 70s, like 5 years ago, and she came out in the New York Times, right? Those are the things that like keep me building who I am and building who this being is. I think identity is something that is ever evolving and that ever shifts, both in terms of presentation and in terms of like kind of that internal feeling. And so, the project that is Tre'vell Anderson is, we still under construction for that very reason. And I'm happy to see that like now there are so many other people who feel they have the ability to come out as non-binary. They have the ability to come out as gender nonconforming. Shout out to India Moore from Pose. They came out as non-binary. I mean, maybe last year. And so like there's the kind of self-making and self-building is one of the great superpowers, I think, of trans folks. I think trans folks, we are divine. We are often, when you look back in history, when you look back in a variety of different cultures, both those that are Black and African, as well as those that are of other cultures and ethnicities, gender nonconforming people, trans folks were deities in a lot of these, ancient countries, ancient communities. We were the people who helped tell and carry on the stories of our communities. We were the people who often were looked at and uplifted in these communities. And unfortunately, because of white supremacy, because of colonialism, because of patriarchy, transphobia, homophobia, we can go down the long list, right? We now live in a society where we're at the bottom of the totem pole. And so much I feel like of what we do as visible, queer and trans and gender expansive people is about unearthing that history, about connecting the dots, about letting those folks know, those transcestors that came before us know that like we see them, we hear them, we feel them, and that they are like the wind pushing us forward.
Ooh, transcestors. I love that. So a lot of marginalized people, we feel the burden of representation because representations of who we are, honest representations of who we are so sparse. And so you feel that enormously as you become more and more prominent. I wonder that as your public profile has heightened, you have this podcast, which I love, already said, and you're on this Netflix documentary and you have this incredible career. As you become a bigger name, do you feel the burden of representation?
Yes, I think it's a responsibility. Most people would say that, they would reframe the question and they wouldn't call it a burden, and they would say it's just a responsibility and, all of that. But it is a burden. And I don't think that like burden has to be a negative word. It is something that I have to consider, something that I have to shoulder in terms of how I show up in the world, right? Because in the same ways that Black folks, right, are still trying to tell the world, right, that we are not a monolith, right, as my community becomes more visible, everyone wants to make a connection to whatever trans or gender nonconforming image that they've seen, right? So whether that's Caitlyn Jenner, whether that is Laverne Cox, whether that is the women on Pose, when in reality, right, we as trans and gender expansive people should be able to exist outside of those representations as well. And so for me, I think, I've gotten very comfortable being, the only trans or gender expansive person in a space, similar to still being, sometimes the only or one of a few Black people in a space. And that is something that I consider, but also something that I'm not shirking the responsibility, because I know that I did not have a gender nonconforming or gender expansive person that I could look to when I was coming up. And if for whatever reason somebody feels as if I could be that for them, or I could at least introduce them to someone else that can be that for them, I mean, why not? I think it just is. It's just something that you have to do. And I often say that, like, this life is not my own, right? Here's where the church queen comes out. This life is not my own. I was put here in this body, in this particular moment for a particular reason. And for me, I think that reason is to be some sort of visible representation of what life can look like beyond the binary. I often say that, like, gender nonconforming people, non-binary people, we exist not in the pink or blue binary world of a man or woman, but somewhere in that lavender recess, but in between the two. And the ways in which that, like, opens up and has the potential to unlock a world of possibilities, not only for us, but also for you as binary folks, right? Like, the idea of the trans imagination is so expansive. It is, we literally create ourselves out of nothing, right? Out of our minds, right? And we show up in the world. And that's why, when Raquel Willis says that, she believes in Black trans power, right? Because who else is out here literally creating themselves, right? Literally manifesting that which is deeply rooted within us and bringing it on the outside, And that's no shade to cis people, okay? That is no shade at all. But, like, that is the lineage to which we belong, right? That is why we as trans people are divine. That is why I often say that, like, God, no matter whatever representations you have on your church fans or in your Mima's house on the wall, God is a Black trans woman, okay? Because who else could create the vastness of possibilities that we all currently exist in? You think a man did that? Come on now. Come on. That just don't make no sense. You see what I'm saying? Anyway, I'm done.
I'm with you. You're preaching. Go on. So this reminds me. Okay, so you mentioned the South, and you are saying things, and it reminds me so much of people that I know. I'm from Oklahoma and Texas, just like country people, and I just appreciate that so much. But there was always, when it came to LGBT identities, like a silence. And I also grew up going to church like 3-4 times a week. Like, we were there. And so queer folks, trans folks, like, existed, but I always was like, are we just not nobody gonna talk about? Like, we're just gonna pretend like this is not a thing? And I wonder if you have a similar experience of seeing the silence and just being like, is it just me? Or
yeah, well, so it's a couple different things, right? It's kind of silence in terms of, like, or silence as a means of survival, right? In some of our communities, Southern communities, Black communities, the religious dogma, right, is so strong that, like, being an openly queer person or an openly trans person, it could have negative effects in terms of your safety, right? Depending on the community that you grow up in. That's just the world that we live in. And then additionally, there are, I think of how it's become common in so many Black narratives, right, to talk about that auntie who got her roommate, right, that she done lived with for 30 years, but we just call it her roommate. We don't call it her wife, right? But we call it her roommate. Or the uncle, right, that no one talks about in your family that died of AIDS, right? Like, those are the narratives that are as uniquely Black as, Juice or Boys in the Hood, that we don't talk about, that we don't give air to breathe to. And what it is it ends up denying us of the fullness of Blackness, like a full understanding of what Blackness looks like, right? And furthermore, what it does is it forces those who are cis, who are straight, who are more binary presenting into these similar boxes of identity that really become, like a straitjacket, right? That at some point in your life, whether it's unfortunately when you're 70 years old, maybe hopefully when you get to college and, you get that little twinkle in your eye for homie who lives down the hall, right? That's one of the reasons why we see so many folks, breaking out and breaking free when they are able to get away from some of the small c conservative communities, right, that they grew up in. For me in particular, we don't have, family lore says that we don't have any openly queer people in our particular family, but I always think back to somebody who was in my grandmother's church that I grew up with, who wasn't openly queer, but we all know of that person, probably the church choir leader. Maybe they're the only man on the usher board. Those people who are queer or who have a queer sensibility to them, right? That have always existed around us and been around us. What about that teacher, right, that you might have had in grade school who you just couldn't understand why nobody else liked them, right? Those are like the ways in which Black queerness, I think, shows up in our lives. But we don't talk about enough because we believe it is emasculating the Black man, or we believe that it is, I remember I used to work at the LA Times, and this was around the time of like the post-Ferguson, post-Mike Brown protests that were happening across the country. And I was covering a protest here in Leimert Park, which, for those who don't know, is like one of the historically Black communities here in Los Angeles. And this Black man, presumably cis man, he's at the protest and he's just going off, talking to himself about the emasculation of the Black man, talking about how the organizer of this particular protest was like in bed literally with the cops. And then he sees me and I am gender nonconforming in presentation. I think I probably had a heel on with pants that were entirely too tight, etc. And he just starts to berate me, right? And saying that like I am the problem with the Black community, that I am the reason why he as a Black man, right, has to leave the protest and go to his third job, that I am the nexus of all his issues as a Black, visibly queer, visibly gender nonconforming person. And in reality, that does not put the onus and the responsibility where it deserves to be, right? You find somebody else lower on the totem pole to you to beat up, when in reality, right, as we're having these conversations in this particular moment, we're talking about the system of white supremacy, we're talking about patriarchy, we're talking about the ways in which these things manifest for us in everyday life. And for me, it's just about, making sure that I hopefully can unlock freedom for a variety of different folks, not just Black and queer and gender nonconforming folks. Like, I want everybody to feel free to, like, we don't talk enough. And this might be taking a left turn. So if it takes a left turn, turn me back. Yeah. But like these ideas about like sexuality and gender identity, it restricts a lot of us from partaking in pleasure. Okay? The things that pleasure us the most, right? We don't talk enough about how conversations that are rooted in homophobia and transphobia block cis people from being able to access the highest, most points of pleasure in your bedroom because you worry about your homies or whomever thinking that you gay because you had somebody lick your booty hole real quick, or stick a little something up there when your G-spot, right, is in, is up there. Like, it's just, they're
I can't hope my mom is not watching. Like,
hi,
so
Mom.
Hi.
Like, those are the ways in which, homophobia, transphobia, and all of these different systems impact all of us, not just the queer and trans community, but also cis folks. Like, imagine imagine as a cis woman, imagine the conversations you might be able to have with your partners, right? If the world didn't make them believe that they had to show up in a particular way.
Yeah.
You know, just imagine, you know, I'm done.
No, I think that is so true. I mean, I definitely have experienced cis men being hesitant to, okay, wait, we're going too deep. Okay, I was like, you're right. You're right.
Yes.
You're right. Okay. I think that it was important that you mentioned that interaction that you had in Leimert Park in Los Angeles, because I mentioned the South, but I do think that sometimes there is people are want to put homophobia or transphobia or racism or whatever as being like the South being like the sole propagators of that stuff. And obviously that's not true. These kinds of ideologies are very pervasive and very deeply rooted.
They show up across the country. I mean, you know, just look at if you look at the list, I don't know what number it's up to in terms of like Black trans women who've been killed in 2020 alone. But if you look at where they are from, like where their bodies were found, you're going to find that it populates and pops up across states. It's not just in the South. It's not just in the Midwest. It's also in these areas that we consider to be bastions of diversity, right? These areas, right, that admittedly, particularly we as queer and trans folks often run to because of the perception of greater acceptance and greater opportunity for us as communities. But like, you know, I also think about the situation, the death of Jamel Moore here in Los Angeles, perpetrated by Ed Buck, a rich white man in West Hollywood. You know, these are in West Hollywood, which for those who don't know is the singular queer the singular queer center here in Los Angeles. And, you know, just a stone's throw away from where the Pride March happens every single June, Jamel Moore was killed.
Yeah.
You know, we don't talk enough about the ways in which all of these isms and obias show up across the country, and particularly how it is all of our responsibilities, right, to uproot them, but particularly the responsibilities of the folks who benefit the most from those isms and obias.
Yeah. And not to like take us deeper into the left turn, but I also think it's useful to think about the ways that our structures, our institutions, our criminal legal system, what some people call the criminal justice system, I don't believe that, like is complicit in the marginalization and the deaths and the murders of trans people and gay folks. Like,
I mean, I'll bring up the story of CeCe McDonald. There's a documentary that Laverne Cox also executive produced called Free CeCe that came out a few years ago. And it tells the story of CeCe McDonald, who is a Black trans woman, Black trans activist, who a man who was attacked. She and her friends were walking from her apartment to a local grocery store, and she was attacked by a group of primarily white men, and she had a knife on her, and she used it in self-defense, and she stabbed him, and he died as a result of that stab wound, and she was found guilty of killing him, and she was placed for part of her sentence, I believe, I don't think it was the whole thing, in a men's prison, right? And the things that does, Orange is the New Black is a really great example of the ways in which trans people are further victimized and further marginalized within within the carceral state, right? Within prisons in particular, Laverne Cox's character. And if you look at that trajectory throughout those, I think, 6 seasons, you see how not only are the other women in the jail trying to lay claim to her body.
Spanish been saying how you still got your dick. That true?
What you got between your legs is your business, and what I got is mine.
Maybe. But my man is out at Lexington, and he's having a real hard time. Hard. Meanwhile, you hiding out in here, pretending to be a female.
but also the ways in which the officers are trying to lay claim to her body. And furthermore, how the broader system, for her protection, quote unquote, they put her in solitary confinement, right? And we see how the story, devolves from there. I'll also bring up Layleen Polanco, who is Afro-Latina, I believe, trans woman in the New York area who died in custody of Rikers Island last Pride, June 2019. And her family is still asking for justice. They're still demonstrating and trying to get, the NYPD and the entire, correction system up there to take accountability for all of that. But it just pops up in so many different ways. And so, to put a point on it, I'll say so many of the obias and isms that Black cis folks are dealing with, we as queer and trans folks are dealing with that, as well as transphobia, as well as unemployment, as well as homelessness, as well as, being forced into sex work as a means of survival. There's the same compounded experiences that Black people broadly feel in terms of having to go in a space and deal with your Blackness and your being a Black man or being a Black woman and battling these stereotypes and these assumptions. We as queer and trans and gender nonconforming people, we deal with that, as well as your homophobia, as well as, your trans misogyny, right? And so I often say that Black people should understand the foolishness that we are dealing with. But so many Black folks, right, again, are they're machinations of white supremacy and they don't know it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So something I appreciated toward the end of the Disclosure documentary was someone, I can't remember who said this, but saying that representation is not just the goal, that representation might help. But also it's important to note that sometimes increased representation, increased visibility actually brings additional violence.
Yeah.
And I wonder how you feel about that, how we are at a moment where there are more trans characters, more trans people, and more representation, but we are seeing so many murders of Black trans women. We're seeing so much violence, so much pointed policy. Trans folks have become pawns in our quote unquote culture war.
Yeah.
How do we handle that?
Visibility is a paradox. Okay. The more we come out of the corners, the closets, the sides, and declare who we are publicly, the more people are able to pinpoint us as the villains they think we are, right? The more they're able to put a name to and an image to who they believe to be the perpetrators of these alleged ideas of deception or these alleged ideas of invading your privacy. And you're right, as trans visibility has increased, so has at least the documented numbers of trans folks who are killed via various forms of violence, whether that be interpersonal violence, whether that be, state-sanctioned violence, etc. And part of that greater documentation is just, people giving a fuck, right, about using people's proper pronouns and, police not misgendering folks. And so part of it could be due to that. But ultimately, you're right. It's about more than just getting characters on TV and in movies. The idea is, in the same ways that visibility is kind of said to be the reason why the majority, right, more than 50% of the country is in favor of same-sex marriage, right? Because of shows like Glee, because of shows like Modern Family that brought gay people into their households every single week. Will and Grace. The idea, I think, with trans representation is that same thing, that you will begin to not only just care about that trans character that you see on screen, but then you will realize that there's actually a trans person behind that character, and you will also care for her as well, right? And that's one of the reasons why we talk so much about having trans people play trans characters, right? So that when you see them on a red carpet or you see them outside of the context of that actual show, you can also build some sort of familiarity, some sort of care and empathy for that individual. Now, in terms of like the other ways that like we need basically people right to show up and advocate on behalf of trans folks, you're right. It's on the legal front. It's this particular administration in the same ways that they've been trashed toward Black people, and they've been trashed toward, Muslim practicing folks, and folks generally from the Middle East. They also have been very intent on literally erasing trans people in particular, and then queer folks more broadly speaking, right? And this shows up in a variety of different ways. We did have a landmark Supreme Court case that ruled it unconstitutional to and a violation of Title VII, I believe, to fire queer and trans people just because they're queer and trans. So, like, you can't do that. But at the same time, on a lot of in a lot of state legislators, you have the bathroom bills that everyone spoke about for the last couple years. But now they've transitioned from talking about bathroom bills and using women and girls sports, right, as a cover for their transphobia, right?
Oh, and so, my God.
Yes.
Let me just tell you, okay, so I have, last week I had this conversation with Kat Black and Lorraine, and I was so struck by the number of people, because they made it a point, like, trans women are not trying to harm you. They're not trying to bring you violence. They're not trying to take anything from you. And so many people were like, what about women's sports? What? I'm like, first of all, you're 50, right? Like you have not played a sport. So what actually what is this thing about that we are so fixated on trans women in women and girls sports? What is that?
It is it's an opportunity for folks who hate trans people to recruit more people, right, that hate trans people, because they believe and they buy into this idea that somehow it is unfair or it is a disadvantage for your cisgender child who's competing in track or skiing or basketball or wrestling to compete against this other child who happens to be trans. And, folks love to talk about hormones. They love to talk about testosterone specifically. As a resource, I want to suggest there's a documentary called Changing the Game that is specifically about trans youth in sports and their battles, right, to be able to play on the teams with which they identify. And you'll be surprised like how baseless really a lot of these arguments are. But because it deals with youth, because it deals with children, that is kind of the bait to get people onto their side. But there really is no foundation. And again, a lot of their thoughts about what makes a person's gender their gender is rooted in these ideas that don't support any woman or any man in terms of how they show up in the world. Yeah. It really is a red herring, if you will, or it's something that they're trying to, pull the wool over a lot of people's eyes. And it's one of the ways, right, that the transphobia becomes legislated in a lot of our communities, and it becomes codified because people say, no, a boy should not be competing against a girl, right? But the foundation, again, is wrong because you're seeing this trans girl as a boy when she's not, right? And we don't have to get into the conversation about hormone blockers, about surgery, about that type. Like, we had the same stuff pop up right around Zaya Wade and Gabrielle Union and Dwayne Wade choosing to affirm their daughter and call her by the name she wants to be called, using the pronouns that she wants to be called. And so many people, particularly in our community, she's too young to, or let me correct that. He's too young to be making that decision. I ain't homophobic, but that just don't make no sense. And it's really like, first of all, that ain't your child. That ain't your business, first and foremost. Okay, if they want to support their child, let them support their child. But secondly, why do we feel so much claim to how others show up in the world?
Yeah.
And the answer is because so many of us are insecure about our own gender. We're insecure about our own sexuality, right?
Okay.
And so listen, okay? So when we see those glimmers pop up in other folks, it endangers us internally. And we're like, oh my God, somebody out there. That's why, right? I hate sometimes using this example, but like, oftentimes when we talk about the ways in which some queer and trans folks are violated and violence is enacted upon them, and killed ultimately in so many cases, we don't often talk about the perpetrators of those violences, and we don't often talk about the ways in which the joy that they see in me activated something within them that they were always told violated how they were supposed to show up in the world. And because they have to continually, right, see us show up as our full Black, queer, and trans and gender expansive selves, they feel as if they need to snuff that out. They feel as if they need to erase that so that they can continue putting their mask on. Because if they're in a space with me with their mask on and I've taken my mask off a long time ago, they feel as if now the attention's on them for them to do the same. And they're not comfortable doing that, right? And so it's just so much. It's just so much.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to go a little bit of a different direction.
Okay.
I know that you graduated from Morehouse. And
that I did.
And I checked the website this morning just to make sure that they still have like gender specific pronouns. Like they still describe itself. It still describes itself as an institution for the education of young men, Black men. And so I wonder, what is the place of a single gender institution in a world where we are increasingly understanding that gender is a spectrum?
So I graduated from Morehouse in 2013. I love Morehouse. I give Morehouse a lot of credit for creating the human being that you see in front of you. But that creation came through a lot of trial and error and a lot of fire and foolishness that I had to deal with navigating that space. In terms of what is the place of a single gender institution? I think the role of schools like Morehouse, like Spelman, like Bennett, are the same as they've always been. I think what's necessary, however, is us thinking differently and thinking beyond the binary in terms of what these institutions look like culturally. Right. And so historically, Morehouse, we say that Morehouse is the nation's headquarters for Black male excellence. And that specificity has allowed Morehouse to create this broader image to the broader world of like, Black men, you go there and you're going to become a lawyer, doctor, teacher, business person, and it's going to change your life.
Man, like they have a reputation.
Listen, they say you can tell a Morehouse man, but you can't tell him much, okay? And they're not wrong. But, I'm interested in the institution actually engaging in conversations about gender, about sexuality that are beyond the binary. I personally, this is my personal opinion, think that the institution can continue to hold on to its, history of being this facility that like men come to improve themselves, while also not neglecting the trans women that are currently students and that have been students at that institution, the gender nonconforming and non-binary people who are currently students and have been students of that institution, as well as the cis women that have been students and graduates of Morehouse College. A lot of people don't know that back in the way back day, Morehouse admitted Black women, Black cis women as students, right? And we don't take away their degrees. We don't take away their pedigree. I mean, I think the majority of them, have gone on and transitioned to another life at this point. But I think there's a way to like really look at the fullness of the history of the Black experience, and of the Black masculine experience, right, in the context of Morehouse, to make space for individuals. They did release what's considered to be an inclusive admittance policy that allows folks who identify as anything other than women to submit applications to the college to be considered for admittance. And, that's controversial within the alumni body. But ultimately, Morehouse, Spelman, all of these single gender institutions have to figure out how they're going to rise to the occasion of this moment. And I will say that Spelman has been explicitly accepting trans and gender nonconforming students and making space for the trans and gender nonconforming students on their campus for, I think I graduated, 7 years ago? And they've been doing it since before I graduated. So there is a space, right, to maybe have these conversations. But again, these ideas of people's masculinity and of their manness and of their malehood and of that culture, we have to think deeper about what it means to be a man.
Yeah.
We have to think deeper about what it means to be masculine in this particular society. We've just got to rise to the occasion and do that. And I think within that, we'll be able to unlock a lot of ways in which institutions like Morehouse and Spelman and Bennett can be that thing that they actually think they are within the Black community. Because right now you're just in it within the Black cis community, and perhaps that's good for you. Perhaps you're content with just repeating over and over every year that Martin Luther King Jr. went there and Spike Lee and Samuel L. Jackson. But what about the Black trans folks that have come out of that institution, myself included, Fatima Jamal included, that also represent the greatness of what this institution can be and what this institution can do for folks, right? Those are the things that I'm considering, that I'm thinking of as, these conversations continue.
Yeah. Do you think that they're gonna get there anytime soon?
No. And I think part of that is because they aren't thinking in that way. They're not thinking in a gender expansive way, despite all of the efforts that are being made by, in particular, students who are currently on campus, as well as some of us, recent alumni, to push the thinking elsewhere. But ultimately, I'm interested in the students who come to Morehouse, come to Spelman, identifying as the sex or their gender that they were assigned at birth, that those institutions cater toward. And for whatever reason, while they are in the course of their education, they have an internal trigger, right, that necessitates that they need to live their authentic selves, live their authentic lives. I'm thinking about the Black trans women that are currently students at Morehouse College, right, who use she, her pronouns, and who don't use she, her pronouns, right, that deserve the opportunity to continue their education, right, that deserve a space, a community, a culture that allows them to continue to pursue whatever that, educational high attainment thing that we do, talented 10th bullshit that we do, right, in our community. Black trans and queer people should be able to be, this is going to sound real, this is going to sound backwards, but Black, queer, and trans people should have the opportunity to be just as respectable as your pastor. Because let's be real, that's what a lot of these HBCUs teach us, right? They teach us how to be respectable, okay? But Black trans people should have the ability to be just as trash as Black cis people, It's just, that is the world that I think I'm fighting for, right? I want everybody to have the equal chance to be trash. I want everyone to have the equal chance to be exceptional as well. And then we can have a conversation separately, right, about all of the other ways in which, education and elitism, right, shows up in our communities.
Yeah. All right, last question. I love your podcast, Fantai. Love it. Think it's so good. I love that you and your co-host Jared work through a phenomenon that we really don't have language for, which is, you have an appreciation for a thing, you see the merits of it, but also you can recognize some of the pitfalls, some of the problematic aspects, but you don't necessarily have to throw the whole thing away.
Yes.
Do you think that the internet, social media, makes it really difficult for us to have nuanced conversations about the things that we enjoy, the things that bring us pleasure?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we created the shows. We were like, we want to give you the nuance that you're missing from your Twitter timeline, okay? Because that, 140 characters, 280 characters, whatever number it's at right now, doesn't really allow us to make the necessary space to really interrogate the people, the places, and things that we love, though we sometimes hate, right? Now, I will say there are some things that perhaps need to be thrown away, completely. Kanye might be that at this point. Let we throw him away. He does his, mental health rehabilitation and all of that stuff, and then he can apply to be brought back. But yeah, that's one of the things that we want to do. And my co-host is Jared Hill. Both of us we're journalists, so research is important to us. Facts are important to us, and not just having a conversation that's like emotional, but having. We like to reference articles. We like to bring on other educated and when I say educated, I mean both formally educated and educated by the streets and educated by experience folks to, bring them on to have these conversations about, the gray areas in our lives, right? And so whether that's talking about, we actually just did an episode on allyship and this idea of, particularly talking about all them black squares that people been posting over the last month, and talking about the language of allyship and challenging, the ways in which we think of our roles as Black people in terms of combating racism, as well as the roles of white people and other non-white people. We did an episode on Kanye. We did an episode on Tyler Perry and the whole Medea cinematic universe is what I call it. And so that's our goal with the show. And, we come out every Thursdays, wherever you get Slayworthy audio. And so I'm glad to hear that you really enjoy it, because, we don't claim to be perfect. We don't claim to have all the answers, but we do claim to be interested in engaging in the conversation about what some of those answers might look like. And so it's something that we started, I think, in February, like right before quarantine. And it's been, something that we've been able to keep going.
Yeah, I love an elevated conversation about trash. I love a citation. Like, if we can just meld the word, like the trashiest with, knowledge, with like expertise, love it.
That's what we need to do, really, right? Especially as Black folks, as queer folks, right? It's about, why can't we make an education out of our culture? Why can't we, seriously interrogate and engage the things that we love and talk about why we love it, but also why we are challenged by it. We can do that, and we deserve to be able to do that with our content as well.
Yeah. Well, that is all I have. Thank you so much, Tre'vell. This conversation was amazing. I appreciate you again.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Be sure to leave a comment down below. Hit me up on Instagram or Twitter. Buy some merch. Sign up for the email newsletter. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you next time. Bye.